so we had some really good discussions in the chat box from Gabby and from Neil about whether or not some of the activities were just about comprehension, really checking comprehension instead of being about visual literacy. Rob, do you want to start? Would you like me to start?
Oh, you can go ahead. I want to talk about the level of complexity that Neil just asked afterwards, but
Okay, no
after
worries.
you.
Thank you. All right. So, like we mentioned, it is not. I mean, some of you were wondering about whether or not it was just checking comprehension, and it was just expressing. They were not expressing themselves through the pictures, but just checking comprehension. Well, it is not checking comprehension. Even these activities. I mean, like we mentioned, visual literacy is two parts. There is first, what is needed is that you need to build the skills required to be able to read an image. So we are at the stage of reading, first of all, in order to fully make them into visual, to be visual literate, they need to be able to read the images. So first, there's this part of work that's needed, and it's very important so that you don't just check comprehension, is that you make use of those VLCs, those visual, those visual clues, because you're not asking them to have a brand new vocab, like Neil was saying, was wondering. You're not asking them brand new vocab. You're just asking them to think along those perspectives. Once they have acquired those skills, this ability to analyze the images, then you go from reading to writing, the creation, you move away from just thinking about it, you go into the creation of it, this ability to create meaning and create images to reflect the way what they want to say. It's basically it's become a multimodal. It's a visual literacy using images is a key component nowadays of multimodal communicative competence. Lots of different English curricula around the world, like I think in Canada, USA, and Canada, US, and Australia. They've actually introduced two new skills. One of them is viewing, and the other one is visually representing, on top of reading, speaking, listening, and writing. So it is now a skill that is needed to be developed, and not just as a thinking, but as a reading text and then writing text. I hope I helped a little bit.
Great. And I wanted to, Neil asked a question here about understanding the difference between using images and worrying about that this would require mastery of the language. And I think this is true of any activity. It could be a crossword puzzle, it could be a text. And, mastery of the activity comes with the complexity of language at every level. So even if we're, having a discussion about the neighborhood at an A1 level, we're limited by the language that we have. So I don't think visual literacy is any different than anything that we're using now in the classroom in that respect. What do you think, Cristina?
Definitely. I mean, it is just obviously you would not start with an elementary learner with such words as vectors, as you wouldn't start teaching them the mixed conditional. It's a question of basically having a scope and sequence that's adapted to the learners. Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
I had an interesting question from I think it was Gabby also who asked, why would language learners want to learn how to read images? I mean, think about it. What's the first thing most of us do in the morning? We take our phones, we check Instagram, we check some form of, communication media. I would say a form of, yes, exactly. So you do check, and this is the first thing. And how is information conveyed nowadays? Information is mostly conveyed through, yes, there are still text, but there are also images. Certain forms of social media just base themselves on images. So this is why we need to teach them that, because otherwise we wouldn't be doing our job as teachers. Our jobs as ESL teachers is to allow them and to give them the tools to effectively communicate. And in the real world, the whole basis of the communicative approach is this real life communicative setting. How could we do that if we do not allow them the tools and do not teach them the tools in order to be able to do that, when most of the data nowadays is multimodal, which is basically more than presented in more than one format. And another thing linked to that, which was I think one of the questions by Neil, about the why would we want to do that? And it's the fact that the language in itself is and it goes back to what Rob was saying. We teach it slowly by grades. Any other questions? That there was somebody did. When is visual taught in L1? Is it transferable to L2? That's the problem also. That was also something else I wanted to link with Neil, is that it's, if you, ideally they should have done this in L1. And we have digital natives that supposedly are good at managing images, but there are studies out there that have shown that those digital natives are not adept at actually being able to use those images, and they're not able to comprehend and produce and interpret visual communication. So what we assume they would know in L1, they still don't know. So that's why we have to do it as L2. Like Neil was saying, is it really our job, or just because the other ones couldn't do it? Unfortunately, it's like reading for gist. When we teach our students, we tell them, okay, read quickly to get the general idea. Like, they've never done that in L1, but they should have, but yet somehow they haven't developed those skills themselves. So we are, yes, Neil, you're right, we are kind of catching up. But this is what we need to do in order to fully allow our students to become competent, to have communicative competency.
And, I'm looking at this, continuing the conversation about using this and overburdening students at a young age. If we think back to how a lot of us learned our L1, we learned with picture dictionaries. We were immediately taught through images from the day we started, before we could even read. And then you move up as we progressed. Kids went into comic books, visual, very little text, all the way up into, as adults now, drive down the road and you see a billboard. You don't see a full thing of text, you're seeing visuals. If we watch TV, visuals. Everywhere around us, we're bombarded with visuals. And we talk about them and we interpret them. And we may not necessarily throughout our life create them or use them very often, but we do need to be able to evaluate and interpret and be able to understand. So I think it's a skill that can start at any age, even though we don't have the language for it yet.
And there is, there is a risk, like I think Neil was mentioning, the risk of overburdening the students, but we would be overburdening them if we were not teaching them an essential skill. If it was just something that was like, yes, definitely, I would agree with you. But in this case, think about it. I mean, when was the last, I don't want to generalize, but when was the last time we saw someone who's 15 actually reading a book or going, yeah, I'm going to read a book today? No, they go, yeah, leave me alone. I want to go on my, whatever is nowadays, TikTok, Instagram. I think it's TikTok nowadays. That's the most, from what I can gather from my own child. So these are those visual images, they are bombarded with them. We wouldn't be doing our due diligence, we wouldn't be doing our duty as educators if we didn't teach them those skills. Yes, it shouldn't take over reading, writing, it should have a place. And those little activities even if you start the lesson, Neil, with just, how's your mood? Create an image to describe how your mood is, and then show that image to to your partner, and then see if he can guess with them. So you have this interaction of images that's produced by the learner. So the power is back to them. And then, the partner has to guess about it. So there's this language. So there are ways to do it without overburdening the student.
And I think another important part too is you talked about is the speed of processing that we have with visual images over auditory, over reading, and the retention rate. The retention rate is much stronger through visuals, and people know this. This is why advertisers have been using this for years. They figured this out long before teachers did, and they've been using visuals because they know how effective it is, and how these visuals will stick in our mind. And I think for us to take advantage of this in language learning, it's a great tool, whatever works.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, completely agree with this. I mean, memory is superior for imaged information, since it's thought, I mean, if you go back a little bit into dual coding and all the, I think it was Pavio's theory, that there are two distinct cognitive systems, one processes the images, one processes the language. Well, supposedly the memory is superior for image info because it has those two representations in the long-term memory of so that's why it's very important. The use of imagery help us to communicate and to compensate for the limitation of our short-term memory. And so that's also another thing. Sylvia, thank you so much for the websites. Those are really interesting. That's a great idea. Now, Gabby, you were mentioning the fact that you felt a little bit awkward or a little bit uncomfortable teaching. You do know, I mean, it's the same principle. I know it might be a bit controversial what I'm going to say, but it's the same principle as native speakers going, I can't teach grammar because I don't know, I've never been taught grammar. You are part of this world, Gabby. You are part of, being also bombarded. Maybe you can, resist a little bit more than our kids right now, but you are part of this world and you are learning. And again, this is something that we can learn as teachers without overburdening us, even though we already have quite a lot to know. But it is a possibility, and you shouldn't feel like an imposter. Like I mentioned, digital natives have not been proven to be better at interpreting or adapting or producing visual material. So no need to feel like an imposter. Well, I don't understand TikTok, Gabby, so I might be out of it also, but I don't see the interest really. But let's just not even go into that.
Well, with this, that it's easier for your niece to read images. If you think back, I'm not a spring chicken anymore, so I've been around a while. Imaging when I was a kid was much more simpler than what we see now. Anything that was put together, usually would focus on just one item or two items. I remember the old car commercials that all you saw was the car and it was a black background. Now, when you look at everything, it's not about the car, it's what's happening around the car. It's the girls dancing in the background. So, people today are bombarded much more with the amount of images and the rate of speed that images change. And I think this is a good thing because it's causing the brain to think and discern much more than ever before. And this is important if we're teaching our students how to recognize things like photoshopped pictures and deepfakes. I saw, it was on CNN this morning, as a matter of fact, there were pictures of Afghan families where they had photoshopped weapons into the pictures. And that was just today. And people are already picking up on it and saying, look, you've got village people walking around with weapons. And it's not true. So we need to be able to discern much more these days. And I think it's helpful if we teach them how to interpret, how to think about it as part of communication, because quite frankly, we're talking about what we see in the news and in front of us every day.
Yeah, I mean, like those deep fake videos. I mean, I think there was one of the Queen dancing along or something like that. And I was like, what? And for a second, even though I knew it was impossible to be true, for a nanosecond, you're shaken. And this is with my, I'm not slightly older years. I'm a little bit, you see this and still you're shaken by it. Now, there was something about how we do need to teach visual by Lee. We do need to teach visual. So we do have to do this, yes. Compare and contrast photos to make predictions and interpretation for FCE and CAE. So yes, it does feed into a little bit the exam room. Now, Rob, Gabby was asking whether or not helping them interpret the images was actually telling them how to think.
Well, there's a key word here. We're telling them how to think, not what to think. As English teachers, aren't we teaching them how to speak, not what to say? I really don't see much of a difference, and I don't see what the problem is, because we're giving them a tool that they can use their own voices to talk about the images that they see. So getting them to open up, and I also do this with music. I'm a musician, and I use music to stimulate mental visuals. And so this is teaching them how to talk about and how to communicate. Because quite frankly, we communicate through images, I feel, more than we do through text on our day-to-day basis. If I mute myself, you're thinking of the image. You're seeing my emotions through images, not through speaking.
And there's something interesting that also Neil was talking about, how there is a rich use of symbols in artists from any time in history. That's true. There's always been this wealth of information within the images, but the people would not see the images on the same, let's say, volume as nowadays. It's that term again, bombarded by it. Like every time we read a text, there's no such thing as a newspaper or an article, anything that doesn't have either an accompanying image or a video or some kind of response that's visual. So this is why it's not about so much the richness, but the quantity of text we have to deal with. I believe Neil needs raised his hand.
Yeah, hello. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
You can, fantastic. First of all, thank you both for an incredibly thought-provoking session. I haven't really thought about any of the gallery teacher sessions quite so deeply as I am about this one, and that's meant as the compliment that it is embodied in. I do question, I think it's perhaps an issue with definition, because a lot of what you seem to be speaking about, and I think Gabby is perhaps going along the same parallel lines as me, is that it seems to me that your activities encourage the discussion of images, but it doesn't create a visual language of its own, or particularly require a visual language of its own. So I'm struggling to understand where good old-fashioned talk about a picture, compare and contrast two images for an FCE CAE exam, which, and we see from the exam specs, is designed specifically to elicit the language functions that in the CEFR are expected at that level of compare and contrast, agree and disagree. Where does that stop? And where does visual literacy start? In other words, what elements of visual literacy are a discrete area which isn't dependent upon the kind of language, functional language, that we've always taught based around looking at a picture. Because otherwise we're doing nothing new.
Rob, do you want to answer? Do you want me to?
Yeah, I'm leaving that one to you, Cristina. Your webinar. Oops, there goes my internet. No.
Well, Neil, that's a very interesting point, and I do see where it might seem that way. I think if you just did take the activities as, okay, zooming out and look, and what, without taking into account the VLCs, without asking them, like kind of like an input. You know, when you have those lessons, you do the input of useful language. Well, the input of useful language here would be the VLCs, but not even language. It would be not only language, but also way of thinking, perspective. So here, I understand what you're saying about, yes, it is quite similar, but you need to highlight the need for these VLCs and asking the students to use them and to shift a little bit the way that they think about, okay, we're not just looking at action, but we're looking at the, not just what is conveyed by the image, but how it is conveyed. So again, the color, the vectors, the all these little VLCs that we discussed. So that would be my main contribution to your question.
That's what I understood, but that doesn't therefore argue for as the level increases. I mean, you're not going to be talking about foreshortening, chiaroscuro, juxtaposition, perspective shift, tonality at an A2 level. But at what point do you need to teach that specific lexis of art appreciation in order to give the students a wider ability to discuss the topic? So I don't know, if you've got a Benetton picture, to say the use of blood is deliberately provocative.
I think, Rob, you will have to jump in, but I think I agree. Yes, they will feel limited, and sometimes this is why, even as when it's reading, listening, speaking, and writing, the normal 4 skills, we feel a little bit limited in our activities. But I think if we turn this a little bit on its head and we ask the learners to use images to speak about images. So, for example, if the image of blood, for example, the imagery of blood, the symbol of blood in the Benetton advert, if they don't have the vocab, why don't they draw the feeling, what they are, what it makes them feel? Then that way, at least at the lower level, that would get them slowly, and then slowly there, and at least they would allow them some kind of communication. And then later on, as the level progresses, then you can introduce slowly those kind of words. It's the same principle as when the phonemic script was introduced a little way back. And people are like, oh, those symbols. Well, you introduce one every couple of weeks. So that they have time. It's learner training. Slowly you get there.
That's the use of L1, I guess, in terms of a mediation through a different language, or translation and translanguaging. You've been very gracious in answering that question. I've taken up a lot of your time in chat. Thank you very much.
No, it's good.
It's very interesting, Neil. It makes me think of it in a different perspective. I mean, I'm a CELTA trainer, and we're not supposed to use, even though there's now a shift towards maybe allowing a little bit of L1, but nothing official. I'm all for using a little bit of maybe translation, translanguaging within, and it does stop, it does break the emotional barrier that comes from, the language classroom being such a stressful environment. I think that's a great idea, Neil. Thank you for that.
Actually, to add to that, years ago, I was fortunate enough to work for a U.S. Embassy program that we did in Brazil, where we had 100 inner-city students a year were actually studying web design, creative design, video, and it was all the visual arts in a specific school. And I was there teaching English. And they were basically inner city teens and young adults who had no English background. And exactly what we ended up learning at A1, A2 level was how to make visuals speak and communicate. And we were talking about things like panorama and justification and all this. And we used all this terminology. So specifically, that was one particular program with a couple of hundred students over a few years. But what I noticed is it just gave them some freedom to be able to discuss things a little deeper than, oh, the picture's red and it's blue. They could get, more in depth about how the picture made them feel. So maybe it's not just talking about vectors and angles and everything else, but it is getting them to communicate and use language, which for me, I'm trying to make them communicate the best way possible. So this is why I find visuals really strong.
Can I just
Luminata? Yeah, Luminita has a question.
So, yes, that's me. Hello, Cristina. Thanks a lot for such an amazing and informative webinar. What I was wondering to ask is that I have been teaching both young learners and teenagers lately. So to me, the greatest question in using visuals is that when I teach young learners, they don't have enough vocabulary to express their own opinions. While I was teaching teenagers, there was a problem of them being too shy and modest in expressing themselves. So how can my question is, what kind of skills or what kind of activities should I use in order to introduce visuals so that they can be constructive, so that they can be of help, and so that they are less challenging? Thank you very much.
That's a great question. Thank you, Luminita. Teenagers, oh goodness me. All right, so one possibility is that they do have, teenagers, we know them, they do have a great ideas, but yes, they're very shy to express them, thinking, worried about ridicule and social pressure and all that. A way you could do that would be like asking them not to speak themselves, but maybe to record their message and not them speaking, but actually having like an avatar speak. And that would kind of detach a little bit. There would be an emotional detachment between their message and the person conveying the message. So that might help a little bit. Maybe try non-personal questions in the sense of not asking them about how is their mood, for example. That might be a little bit too much for them, but asking them, how was someone they know, maybe someone on TV, and then slowly you build the vocab through talking about other people, then maybe at the end of the year, once they feel a bit more comfortable, then you can shift towards them talking about themselves. That would be my idea anyway for teenagers.
And if I could add to that, Cristina, what we were talking about today, years ago in the course with teenagers, what I actually had them do was produce their own videos. And what they did is, because they were working outside, working by themselves or in smaller groups, they felt much more comfortable. They brought these videos into the classroom. And what was happening is a community was built. They got over their shyness. I have one video that I always show when I do these talks on it, was a girl who would not speak in the classroom. And when she brought in her video, the girl was as fluent as I was. And once the other students saw that she could speak, they wouldn't let her get away with oh, no. And the great thing is I still talk with this girl, and she's became an actress and a judge. And this is a girl who would not speak for years in the classroom. By allowing them to produce something outside, they gain their comfort zone, and this gives them ability. For young learners, Cristina, I'm going to leave that to you because I don't deal with little kids.
Thank you.
They scare me.
Yeah. Oh well. Yeah, I have dealt with young learners. Young learners. It's an idea that I've kind of touched upon with Neil, is the use of images to talk about images. Give them a couple of, use very simple images at a younger age. So maybe emoticons in order to talk about feelings. So have them, on the wall, all the emoticons, their feelings underneath. You go over them at the beginning of the lesson or at the beginning of the class, and then afterwards of the year, and then afterwards, as you are discussing, they can, even if they don't want to speak or they don't have the ability, you can just ask them to stand up and then point to the image that represents the feeling, or the feeling they feel, or the feeling that is portrayed in the image. So that could be a good idea. All right. Sylvia was asking something about books. Sylvia, do you wanna ask your question?
Hi, everybody. It's not actually a question. Nice to meet you all. Actually, it's not a question. It was just a thought. So I think books are so rich in images, you can't but use them. And so I was just responding to Gabby's question, actually, nothing more, nothing less.
You're totally right, and thank you. Yes, you're right. I mean, books have a plethora of images, and I mean, that's the point of using course books, to facilitate our life. But Sylvia, just an idea about, when we were talking about giving, when I was talking about giving back the power to the students, sometimes asking the students, because they all have their phones with them. Sometimes, even if you have a plethora of images in the course book, it might be also a good idea from time to time to ask them to, guys, go in your gallery and pick an image that you love, hate, whatever. So just, I know I'm guilty of that, sometimes just relying on the course book a little bit too much. And I have to remind myself to go, Cristina, they have images. I mean, they take their lives taking selfies. So use that. And I think that's also a good point.
Thanks a lot. I do agree with you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Okay.
Cristina, can I have a question? I can see in the Q&A, Luminita had a question already about evaluating, assessing the students' level of visual literacy. And can you please expand on your answer regarding this and the visual literacy sub-skills, please?
Sure. I mean, the thing is that nowadays, all the texts have those two modes of communication. We've got the written language and we've got the images. Now, one way to be able to assess whether or not your students are visually literate is by using, like the same way we have in reading. You have skimming and scanning, or detailed reading for detailed understanding, or gist and listening for specific info. You have the same thing in visual literacy. That is considered a scale on its own. You have actually 11 sub-skills to this. I'm not going to name them all, but it ranges from what Gabby was talking about earlier, which were more thinking skills, to the reading abilities, the ability to read the image. So we're talking about critical viewing, visual reasoning, visual association, and then we go into more the creative sub-skills of visual literacy, like visual reconstruction, constructing meaning, reconstructing meaning, knowledge of, and this ties with what Neil was saying, knowledge of visual vocab, definition, and knowledge of visual conventions. So obviously, like all skills, they go, higher processes as you go higher. So that would be ways that you could. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, I think, some of the stuff with going into breaking down the picture as far as, the different aspects of it, I like to work more with the feeling, because this is what they're going to be talking about throughout their life. For instance, I'm looking here. Well, let's see. I see a woman with flowers on the side, and I'm talking. They're at an angle. It's perfectly framing the picture, and I can see the splash of color. I don't do this very often in life, but I can tell you, my feeling is it's a very warm feeling. It makes me feel comfortable, warm at home, and this is an important thing that we need to get our students comfortable with, that they can talk about feelings and emotions based on a simple image. And I remember as a kid, growing up in school, we used to use National Geographic pictures for this. We used to cut out magazine pictures and everything else and bring these in and talk about how they made us feel. So, I think, like everything else, it's just another tool that we're getting them to think and to interpret and use their voice and communicate.
I agree, definitely. Feeling is quite an important component. I think I was seeing it a little bit more from, like quantitative kind of,
Yes.
Perspective, because, we always have those. Whenever we bring a new idea to the table, we always have somebody higher up that kind of says, oh well, why don't okay, but how are we gonna test that in the exam?
Right.
So that is a bit of a problem. I mean, you can go with the soft skills. You can go also into to mesh those two approaches, more feeling and more something a little bit quantitative. You could go into also the what we call the 3 C's and the 3 S's, which were basically how they were used to help students discuss and analyze the elements of the films, of the film text. So we're talking about, for example, color, camera, character, and for each of them you could have like questions, and then from that the answers to these questions could help you, evaluate the visual literacy level of your students. Then you have the 3 S's, which are story, setting, and sound. Again, sub-questions, then you can assess. So I'm thinking about more of a way to assess in a quantitative way. But you're completely right. It is extremely hard for them to talk about feelings, and it's provocative, like Hedwig was saying. It makes them think, and this is what we're aiming. We are aiming for a group of thinkers in our classroom.
Yeah, sometimes I deal with this now with adults working in business with graphs, because you show them a complex graph, and what do they say? Well, it went up, it went down. And
yes.
Wait a minute, there's a lot more words. There's plummet, there's sword, but it went up, it went down. And I think part of this is because we didn't really concentrate on everything. We just went for the superficial. So this is why I think visual literacy, really helps. Again, I see this, it's not part of the initial teacher training. Perhaps it's time that it is.
I mean, it's not at all. I mean, I know of some, and I can't think of any. I mean, there's the only thing that we touch on literacy is adult literacy. I mean, this kind of ties in with what Gabby is asking, which is in the chat room, that if visual literacy is a valid competence taught in EFL classroom, would you say that teachers should be pushed to break down the skills into visual sub-skills and include them in the lesson plan? Do you think that teachers really have enough knowledge to do that? And I don't think it's part of any initial teacher training program. It isn't, but like I said, it is part of some English curricula around the world. So I'm wondering, and this is a point that would be good to get into, is whether or not in those countries like in Australia and in Canada, whether or not now visual literacy is part of the teacher training program. And by breaking it down in sub-skills, I know it sounds a little bit robotic for something that is so emotionally charged, But then again, I'm seeing it from the point of view of always having someone above me, especially when I deal a lot with governmental agencies and, for national educational program. And they're always, okay, that's very nice, but how are you going to quantify? How are you going to test that? That's the big question. Mm-hmm. So yes, it does seem a little bit like, why would we want to break it into sub-skills? But you do need to break it down into sub-skills in order to be able, even on the lesson plan, just to indicate what kind of objective it is. Mm-hmm. And maybe teachers do not have enough knowledge now, and this is part of the discussion now, is that it is essential. It's essential for today's communicative competence, and yet teachers are quite unaware of it, and hence this masterclass.
One thing I'd like to add to it is, we talked a little bit about it. Something I've been involved in over the years is the Visual Arts Circle, which is a collective of teachers all over the world that are working with different aspects of visual arts and to improve English language learning. Some of you may be familiar with the Image Conference, which used to be held once a year around the world pre-pandemic, and we hope to have another one. I just talked with the directors today, and after the pandemic, we'll be back on the road again. But, these are strictly conferences that just deal with things like visual literacy and, getting into new communication ways, even dealing with people that basically have problems with expressing, and physical and mental problems for being able to discern differences. So it's very interesting. Look for it. It's on the web. But we need more of this, and we need more teaching, and I think there needs to be more awareness for this with general teaching. So hopefully we'll see it on the CELTA and in teacher training in the future.
This links to what Sylvia is saying that she believes that it's especially for dyslexic learners and any weaker pupils, they can be quite powerful. And yes, it gives them a voice. It allows them to have a voice when either shyness or even physical or mental disability stops them from being able to express themselves fully. I think Gabby raised her hand.
Hello.
Hiya.
Oh, hi, Cristina. Hi, Rob.
Hi.
Sorry, I have to say it. I know Neil has already said this, but I need to say it myself. I mean, I sometimes, when we talk about visual literacy, okay, I feel like we are just inventing or putting a new label to very, very old, good old technique of eliciting, using images for the purpose of eliciting, because I really I just fail to see how, as an English teacher, I may potentially be qualified to help my learners become better image readers. So you see, like in my classroom, I'm just trying to think of what I do in my classroom, my daily practice, and I use images for the purpose of eliciting language. So it's a tool, okay? So it's not an image, it's not a destination here. It's just a vehicle for students to produce language, which is the main objective in the EFL classroom. So, and also I feel like you said that students can communicate in images, which is fine. But then when they study a second language, they don't, what's the point of communicating in images? I mean, students learn a second language to be able to communicate in this language, not through images. So the only time when they communicate through images is when I check understanding. So I may ask my students to say, I don't know, translate a grammatical concept into images, or the activity that you demonstrated earlier about a book, right? And and translating this into or changing it into a cartoon, for example. But this is all part of checking understanding as a teacher. So I can't really see, in good faith, I would never ever be able to say that I teach my students how to be visually literate, because I myself am not visually literate, maybe by someone else's standard. I just simply, I don't even understand what it means, because obviously as we grow up in L1 as well, we are surrounded with images, and we develop this skill whether we want it or not. So we interpret images, we read images. So why would I be adding it to my lesson planning, you know?
I'd like to answer that. Sure. We teach them how to read a book. We teach them how to listen. Why don't we teach them how to interpret a visual? Because let's look at what's happening. What are we all staring at? A computer or a cell phone. Everything that we face these days, I think much more than the old days, is about visual. Building a website, building my personal Instagram page, making an Instagram post. All this is visual that we didn't have access to this equipment in the old days. So we drew a picture or maybe took one photograph. But what we're seeing, if you look at what the future skills are and the future career jobs are, you know, we're looking at jobs which are all about creating content. And where is that content heading? Mostly visual, because visual will cross L1, L2, L15, and the same visual can speak to multiple languages at the same time. And that's something, as English teachers, it's exciting that I can get people to understand in any language with just a visual.
But Rob, but wouldn't you agree if I said that, because you said we teach students how to read a book. Well, I don't think we teach students how to read a book. We teach students the language to help them understand the book they will be reading. So there is a slight difference between these two. So perhaps this is how we should be approaching images. So we don't teach them how to read images. We teach students how to talk about images. So we give them the language. So now whether they read an image correctly or incorrectly is not my business. My business as a language teacher is to assess the language and give students the language needed to express themselves. But I am not the one who will be evaluating, assessing or correcting students' interpretation of images.
But when they're reading, are we just teaching them to read the words and not to discern what the feeling and what the meaning behind those words were? I think that's the same correlation. We're not just teaching them dictionary terminology when they read a novel or a poem. We're getting them to feel. And, you know, this is where I think, you know, they're almost even.
Yeah, and you are absolutely right. Yes, I agree with that. So this is, you know, we teach them how to interpret the language, right? But then again, what I'm saying is you use an image, okay, to help students develop linguistically, to be able to talk about feelings. But my point is that the interpretation of an image is irrelevant, because if you look at a sad picture and what you see is a happy picture, then once you try to describe this happy picture to me, I can see that this is the language that you are missing. And I mean, am I in the position to actually correct you and say, no, look, this is a sad picture, so you shouldn't be describing it this way? So this is why I struggle to really understand what this visual literacy has got to do with EFL?
Well, I think if we look at it, I mean, if I may just jump in here, if we look at it like when you said you don't teach them how to read, well, on the top-down, approach, yeah, we don't, but on the bottom-up, we kind of do. For example, we allow them to decipher the language in a different way when we teach them in a bottom-up approach how to check when the voice, when you inhale so that you're going to start a new word, those kind of things. We do teach them a little bit how to listen and how to process the information that they're listening. And I think visual literacy is a little bit like that. We are giving them on the bottom-up kind of approach, the tools to decipher. I kind of agree with you. We're not here to censor or to approve of their interpretation, but we are here to give them the tools to get to that interpretation that will be wholly personal. I think it's a little bit of a paradigm shift. We see language as reading, speaking, listening, and reading. Did I forget that one? Yeah, I think so. But we should also see that visual literacy is another skill, and that producing the image in itself is the end goal. It is not speaking about the image. It is producing the image to reflect the way they think. And I know Neil had a good point about saying, is that really our job? It is, because nowadays that's how we communicate. And therefore we need to stop maybe thinking about, oh, this is speaking about the language. It is speaking about the image. No, it's the end goal is this, because that's how nowadays people communicate. That weird image is another subskill is another skill of language.
Thank you, Cristina. Yes, I mean, I can see those, there are comments in the chat box. I really don't want to hog the session. So thank you, Rob. Thank you, Cristina. That was very, very helpful and very interesting.
Thank you. I would disagree with Sylvia. Okay, Luminita said, I would disagree with Sylvia in terms of assessing only the language a teacher teaches. A teacher, in my opinion, should be the one who makes a student a thinker, a practitioner, someone who can critically react to things around himself. Yes, ideally, Luminita. That's what we want. We want critical thinkers. We want people that are moved by the material we show them, or that move others in an ideal world.
Again, it's the how and not the what. And I think giving them the ability to think about it, this is, we've decided as English teachers to take on critical thinking years ago, and that's become such a part of the curriculum these days. If we're going to do it, let's go all the way. And why not work with visual literacy?
I think that's a very good point. It's like we've opened Pandora's box now.
And I do agree to some extent, we seem to have taken on a lot more than just teaching English these days. Sometimes I wish I became a math teacher, because they're not dealing with that. But
let's not start that conversation with math teachers tweeting us saying, yes, we do.
Yeah. Well, they do talk about angles and vectors. So
they do. But I think it is definitely a paradigm shift. In order to teach visual literacy, we need to give it back its coat of arms. Well, give it its coat of arms as a skill, as an end goal in itself. The image is the end goal. The image is a way of communicating on the same kind of, like level as the other four skills.
And I agree. I saw one of the things that Neil put in here that, due to culture and different cultures see things differently, different cultures see different words differently. We have this in everything. And it's another way dealing with intercultural competence. This is something we need to learn also, to discern what the image is based on the culture that it came from. If I were to put up a picture of you know, people barbecuing a cow in Texas and showed this in India, that's insensitive. Just like if an American or a British saw people in Vietnam barbecuing a dog, you know, yes, we have to understand culture changes.
Yeah, I mean, Neil is completely right about the nodding the head. It took me years. I mean, and I'm partly based in the Middle East. It took me years to understand that this, meant yes or no. I was like, what do you, yes, no, this means no. And I'm like,
yes,
why do you nod your head? Just go sideways. But yeah, so lots of very fun misunderstanding ensued. Thank you so much, guys, for your feedback. I had some great, thank you, Luminita. Thank you, Sylvia. Oh, thank you, Maria. That's very kind. In exam classes, students often have different ideas about the same bar chart. Yes, I mean, for any of us that had to teach, business English, uphill struggle trying to get them to look beyond what they see, the general trend of a chart or just the different colors, and trying to get into, there is a habit of just seeing an image as what is the action behind it, instead of what are the components of the way to portray the action. So that's something we need to do without overburdening our students.